The restaurant was loud in the way busy restaurants always are. Plates clinking, low conversations floating between tables, the occasional burst of laughter from strangers who had no idea what was unfolding only a few feet away. But at one table, the atmosphere felt completely different. Heavy. Still. Uncomfortable. In the center of the table, resting between two untouched glasses of water, sat a small velvet box. It wasn't closed anymore. The lid had been pushed back, revealing the engagement ring inside. Under the warm restaurant lighting, the diamond caught the light every few seconds, flashing briefly like it was trying to demand attention. But neither of them reached for it. Daniel sat back in his chair, staring at the ring as if it didn't belong there. His eyes moved between the box and the table surface, never quite meeting Lisa's gaze. His posture was stiff, his hands resting flat against the table like he was forcing himself not to move. Across from him, Lisa remained quiet. Too quiet. She wasn't crying. She wasn't angry. She simply sat there, her fingers wrapped loosely around the edge of her napkin, twisting it slowly without even realizing she was doing it. Anyone looking over would immediately feel it. Something had gone very wrong. Normally, a moment like this would be joyful. A ring on a table usually means celebration, excitement, a couple stepping into the next chapter of their lives together. But tonight, the ring felt less like a promise and more like evidence. Evidence of a conversation that had gone completely off the rails. Daniel finally exhaled slowly, the kind of long breath someone takes when they're trying to stay calm even though their mind is racing. His eyes lifted slightly toward Lisa, but only for a moment. "You could have told me," he said quietly. Lisa didn't answer right away. Instead, her eyes dropped toward the ring again, as if the small object sitting between them now carried the weight of everything that had been said, and everything that still hadn't. Silence filled the space between them. And sometimes, silence inside a relationship says more than shouting ever could. When people argue loudly, emotions are obvious. Anger, frustration, hurt, everything is on the surface. It's messy, but it's clear. Silence is different. Silence often means someone is processing something deeper, something that doesn't have an easy explanation, something that can't be fixed with a quick apology. That was the kind of silence sitting at their table now. Daniel looked down again at the ring. His fingers moved slightly toward the box for a brief second, then stopped. He didn't pick it up. That tiny hesitation said everything. Because a few hours earlier, that ring had meant something completely different. Just earlier that day, it represented commitment, trust, and a future they were both supposed to be excited about. Now it felt like a question Daniel didn't seem ready to answer. Lisa finally spoke, her voice soft but strained. It wasn't supposed to come out like this. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, but it did. Another pause, another heavy silence. Lisa looked like she wanted to explain something, but the words weren't coming easily. Her expression carried the kind of discomfort that only appears when someone knows there's still a piece of the story missing. And Daniel knew it too, because the argument that brought them here didn't actually start tonight. That was the part no one else in the restaurant could possibly know. To anyone watching from across the room, this might have looked like a couple having a tense dinner conversation. Maybe a disagreement about the future. Maybe nerves about a big commitment. But the tension sitting between them tonight had been building for much longer than the last few minutes. In fact, the real chain reaction started the night before. Something had been said. Something that Daniel hadn't expected to hear. And once that information was out in the open, it changed the way he saw everything. The relationship, the proposal, even the meaning behind the ring sitting on the table now. That was why Daniel hadn't picked it up. Not yet. Because before he could decide what the ring meant, there was still one question sitting in the air between them. A question Lisa hadn't fully answered. And until she did, that small diamond resting in the velvet box would remain exactly where it was, untouched, unresolved, and carrying a tension neither of them could ignore. The tension at the restaurant didn't appear out of nowhere. In fact, if you rewind the story just 24 hours, the situation between Daniel and Lisa looked completely different. The energy was lighter, the conversations were easier, and the idea of an engagement didn't seem like a looming question hanging over everything. But then something happened the night before. Not a dramatic betrayal, not a screaming fight, not even a major disagreement. It was something far more awkward. And strangely enough, far more revealing. Late that evening, what started as a normal night suddenly turned uncomfortable for Lisa in a way she hadn't expected. She had been feeling fine earlier, laughing, talking, acting like everything was perfectly normal. But then, the illness hit. At first it was subtle, a wave of dizziness, a strange feeling in her stomach, the kind of discomfort people often try to brush off because they don't want to ruin the mood. She tried to pretend everything was fine. But Daniel noticed. He asked if she was okay. Lisa gave the classic response people give when they're clearly not okay. Yeah, I'm fine. Of course, she wasn't. Within minutes, it became obvious that the situation was escalating quickly. The kind of moment where pride disappears and survival mode kicks in. And suddenly, the entire evening shifted. Daniel went from partner to full caretaker mode almost instantly, grabbing water, trying to help her sit down, asking if she needed anything. The calm, composed version of Lisa that Daniel usually saw had completely vanished. Instead, there she was, vulnerable, embarrassed, and unable to hide it. Moments like that can be incredibly uncomfortable. But they also do something interesting to people psychologically. Embarrassment strips away emotional armor. When someone experiences a humiliating or vulnerable moment, the energy of the relationship changes. Walls drop. Carefully controlled versions of ourselves disappear. People stop performing and start reacting honestly. And that's exactly the kind of shift that happened between Daniel and Lisa that night. Because while Daniel was trying to help, Lisa couldn't hide the embarrassment on her face. The situation had gone from bad to worse quickly, and she knew it. The kind of moment where later you laugh about it. But in the moment, it feels like the most humiliating thing imaginable. Daniel, to his credit, didn't mock her or act annoyed. If anything, he tried to lighten the situation. He cracked small jokes, the kind people make when they're trying to keep someone from feeling completely mortified. Hey, he said at one point, half smiling, this is definitely not how I imagined our night going. Lisa gave a weak laugh, shaking her head. Trust me, she replied, this is not how I imagined it either. But beneath the humor, something deeper was happening. Moments of vulnerability often create unexpected honesty. When people feel exposed, they sometimes start thinking about all the other things they've been hiding. Secrets feel heavier when you're already emotionally raw. And that night, Lisa felt exactly like that. Exposed, embarrassed, and strangely aware that Daniel was seeing a side of her she rarely allowed anyone to see. Not the composed version, not the confident version, just the human one. Psychologists often point out that humiliation has a strange effect on relationships. It lowers defenses quickly. It accelerates emotional intimacy in ways that normal conversations never do. But it can also trigger another reaction. When someone feels vulnerable, they sometimes rush to prove something about themselves. Honesty, loyalty, transparency. Almost like they're trying to regain control of the narrative. Looking back later, that's the moment some people think the real chain reaction started. Because Lisa spent the rest of that night unusually quiet. Daniel noticed it. He assumed she was still recovering from the illness, maybe tired, maybe just ready for the day to be over. He didn't push for conversation. But inside Lisa's mind, something else was happening. She was thinking about the past, about things Daniel didn't fully know, about conversations she had postponed again and again because the timing never felt right. And suddenly, after such an embarrassing and vulnerable moment, those hidden pieces of her life started feeling impossible to ignore. By the time the next morning arrived, Lisa was still turning those thoughts over in her head. Should she tell him? Should she wait? Was it even necessary to bring it up now? Throughout the entire day, those questions followed her everywhere. Every quiet moment became another internal debate. Part of her believed honesty was the right move. Another part worried that bringing up the truth would change how Daniel saw her, because once certain things are said out loud, They can't be taken back. And the longer she thought about it, the more the pressure built. By the time evening arrived and they sat down for dinner, Lisa had already spent hours fighting with herself about one decision: tell him the truth, or let the past stay buried. Eventually, that internal debate reached its breaking point. Because during that dinner conversation, the same one that ended with a ring sitting untouched on the table, Lisa finally decided to speak. What she said next would completely change the mood of the entire evening. And within minutes, the calm dinner conversation turned into the tense silence now sitting between them. By the time evening arrived, both of them were hoping the tension from the night before had mostly passed. At least, that's what Daniel believed. From his perspective, the strange illness episode had simply been one of those awkward life moments couples laugh about later. Embarrassing at the time, sure, but not something that would leave a long shadow over the relationship. So when they arrived at the restaurant the next night, Daniel assumed the evening would feel normal again. A reset, the kind of dinner where the mood slowly returns to normal and the previous night becomes nothing more than a slightly ridiculous story. At first, everything appeared calm enough. The restaurant lighting was warm, the music soft enough that conversations could flow easily. Waiters moved between tables carrying plates and glasses, while other couples leaned toward each other in quiet conversation. For most people in the room, it was just another peaceful dinner. But at their table, something felt slightly off. Lisa was quiet. Not the relaxed kind of quiet where someone is simply enjoying the moment. This was a different kind of silence, the kind that happens when someone's mind is somewhere else entirely. Daniel noticed it almost immediately. She glanced down at the menu, but her eyes weren't really scanning the words. Her fingers tapped lightly against the table. Every now and then she took a small breath like she was about to say something, and then stopped herself. To Daniel, it looked like nervous energy, which made sense in a way. The relationship had been moving forward quickly, and there was already a lot to process. Big conversations tend to make people anxious, especially when the future of the relationship is starting to feel very real. So Daniel assumed she just needed time to settle into the evening. Long day? He asked casually. Lisa gave a small nod. Yeah, something like that. From the outside, the exchange sounded normal enough. But something about her tone suggested there was more behind it. And sometimes in relationships, people sense when a conversation is coming before it actually begins. Small behaviors give it away. The hesitation, the distracted focus, the feeling that someone is quietly rehearsing words in their head. Lisa had been doing exactly that all day, debating whether or not she should say what was on her mind. Across the table, Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, trying to keep the atmosphere relaxed. He talked about a few ordinary things: work, plans for the week, random observations about the restaurant. But Lisa's attention kept drifting. Eventually, Daniel paused. "You okay?" he asked again, this time more directly. Lisa looked up at him. For a second, it seemed like she might brush the question aside the way people often do when they're not ready to talk. But instead, she exhaled slowly. "There's something I should probably tell you." Those words have a strange effect in conversations. They instantly shift the mood. Daniel's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't look worried yet. People say things like that all the time before sharing something small. A funny story, a random confession, something from their past that just suddenly feels relevant. So he nodded. "Okay." Lisa hesitated. Her fingers wrapped around her glass for a moment, then she set it back down. "It's about my past," she said. Now Daniel's attention sharpened. Because when someone says those words in a serious tone, it usually means the conversation is about to go somewhere unexpected. Lisa looked down briefly before continuing. "I've been married before." Daniel blinked once. That wasn't exactly shocking. Plenty of people have previous marriages, especially as life gets more complicated and relationships evolve over time. In fact, Daniel had assumed there might have been at least one previous relationship like that, so his reaction stayed calm. "Okay," he said slowly. "That's not a big deal." Lisa nodded slightly, but she didn't look relieved, because the next part of the sentence still hadn't come out. She took another breath. "I've actually been married, more than once." Daniel tilted his head a little. "Still not alarming." One marriage. Two marriages. Life happens. Relationships fail. People move forward. None of that automatically destroys a relationship. But Lisa wasn't finished. She looked up at him again, this time with the kind of expression someone has when they know the next sentence is going to change the entire tone of the conversation. 5 times, she said quietly. For a moment, Daniel didn't react at all. It was the kind of number that takes a second to process. 5, not one, not two. 5 separate marriages. And suddenly, the calm rhythm of the dinner conversation disappeared. Because numbers have power in relationships. A single previous marriage suggests experience. 2 might suggest complicated history. But 5 instantly raises questions, not just about the past, but about patterns, decisions, expectations, and what commitment means moving forward. Across the table, Daniel's expression shifted slightly as the reality of the number settled in. He hadn't expected that, and the audience watching this moment unfold would likely feel the same way he did. A revelation like that doesn't just add information to the conversation, it changes the entire frame of the relationship. Because now a new question was sitting silently between them. Why had this never come up before? Why tonight? And why now, when the relationship was already moving towards something serious? But even that surprising number wasn't the part that would hit Daniel the hardest, because the next detail Lisa revealed made the situation even more complicated. The number had already shifted the atmosphere at the table. 5 marriages. For a moment, Daniel simply sat there, letting the information settle. His expression didn't explode into anger or disbelief the way some people might expect. Instead, it changed in a quieter way. His posture straightened slightly. His eyes became more focused. It was the kind of reaction someone has when they suddenly realize a conversation is more serious than they originally thought. Across the table, Lisa could see the shift immediately. And she knew something else still had to be said. Because the number alone wasn't the full story, she hesitated again, clearly weighing how to continue. For a brief second, it looked like she might stop there, like maybe revealing the 5 marriages was enough honesty for one evening. But Daniel's silence made it impossible to leave the conversation unfinished. What? He asked quietly. There's more, isn't there? Lisa nodded slowly. There's something about the last one. That sentence landed heavily in the space between them. When someone phrases a story like that, it signals that the next detail might complicate things even further. Lisa looked down at the table again before continuing. My most recent marriage technically isn't finalized yet. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, in confusion. What do you mean not finalized? He asked. Lisa took a breath. I mean, the divorce paperwork hasn't fully gone through yet. The words hung there. For the first time that evening, Daniel leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening in a way that made it clear the conversation had just crossed into completely new territory. Because this wasn't just history anymore. This was something current, something unresolved. And in many relationships, unresolved legal ties carry a very different emotional weight than past ones. Lisa quickly tried to explain. We've been separated for a long time, she said. Emotionally, it's completely over. There's nothing there anymore. From her perspective, that distinction mattered. A relationship can end emotionally long before the paperwork catches up. Many people move on with their lives while legal processes slowly grind forward in the background. To Lisa, the marriage was already finished in every way that truly mattered. The paperwork was just a formality. But Daniel's reaction suggested he saw things differently. He sat back again, processing the new information piece by piece. Cultural expectations around marriage can shape how people interpret situations like this. In many communities, legal ties aren't viewed as small technical details. They represent commitment, responsibility, and sometimes reputation. An unfinished marriage, even if emotionally over, can still feel like unfinished business. Daniel rubbed his hand along the side of his jaw, thinking. So you're still legally married? He asked carefully. Lisa shook her head quickly. No, I mean, it's basically done. The process just hasn't officially wrapped up. Daniel didn't interrupt her explanation, but the distinction clearly mattered to him. Because from a legal standpoint, there's a big difference between basically done and officially done. And when engagement is part of the conversation, when the future is already being discussed, those differences can suddenly feel much larger. Lisa seemed to sense the shift in his thinking. That's why I wanted to tell you, she added. I didn't want it to come up later and make it look like I was hiding something. Her words were sincere. But sincerity doesn't always erase the shock of unexpected information, especially when the timing raises new questions. Daniel's voice remained calm, but there was a new seriousness behind it now. When were you planning to mention this? He asked. Lisa hesitated. That hesitation alone created another layer of tension, because timing matters in relationships just as much as honesty itself. Revealing something difficult can strengthen trust, but revealing it late can sometimes make the same truth feel like a secret. Lisa looked back at him. I was going to tell you, she said quietly. Daniel nodded slightly, but he didn't respond right away. Inside his mind, several thoughts were likely colliding at once. 5 marriages, one that wasn't legally finished, and the realization that this information was only appearing now, during a dinner that was supposed to feel hopeful. Psychologically, moments like this trigger a natural instinct in many people. When new information disrupts a narrative we've already built about someone, our brains immediately start reevaluating everything that came before it. Was something misunderstood? Was something left unsaid? Was the full story always there, or only parts of it? Across the table, Lisa could feel the weight of that reevaluation happening in real time. And slowly, almost without either of them planning it, both of their eyes drifted toward the same object sitting between them, the engagement ring. Just hours earlier, it symbolized excitement, a step forward, a future together. But now, sitting quietly on the table under the soft restaurant lighting, the ring looked different. Not like a promise, more like a question. And suddenly, that small piece of jewelry became the center of the entire conversation. The restaurant continued around them like nothing had changed. Glasses clinked. Waiters walked past carrying plates. Conversations from nearby tables floated through the air in soft fragments. But at their table, the atmosphere had become still, heavy. Daniel's eyes moved briefly toward the engagement ring resting near the center of the table. The diamond caught the light again, flashing softly under the warm lamps above them. Just hours earlier, that ring represented excitement. A future they were both supposed to be stepping into together. Now it represented something else entirely. A decision that suddenly felt far more complicated than it had that morning. Lisa followed his gaze. For a moment, she simply looked at the ring. Her expression was difficult to read, part uncertainty, part reflection, part something deeper that even she might not have fully understood yet. When people find themselves in emotionally tense situations, small gestures often speak louder than long explanations. And sometimes those gestures happen almost instinctively. Lisa slowly reached toward her hand. Daniel noticed immediately. He didn't say anything. He didn't stop her. He just watched. Carefully, Lisa slid the ring off her finger. The movement wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden anger, no sharp motion meant to make a point. Instead, it happened slowly, almost thoughtfully, like someone removing a piece of jewelry they suddenly realized they weren't sure they should be wearing. The metal caught the light again as it slipped free. For a brief second, the ring rested in her fingers. Then she placed it gently on the table, right next to the velvet box it had come from. The sound it made was barely noticeable, a faint tap against the surface, but in that moment it felt louder than anything else in the restaurant. And then she leaned back slightly in her chair. Across from her, Daniel didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand an explanation. He didn't even reach for the ring. He simply looked at it. Silence settled over the table again. In many arguments, anger is what people expect to see. Raised voices, defensive explanations, emotional reactions that make it clear how both sides are feeling. But silence can sometimes be far more unsettling. Silence leaves room for interpretation. It forces both people to sit with their thoughts rather than reacting in the heat of the moment. And in relationships, that kind of silence can feel heavier than shouting. Lisa glanced up at Daniel, almost cautiously. Part of her might have expected him to say something immediately, to stop her, to push the ring back toward her and say the conversation didn't change anything. Viewers watching a moment like this often expect that kind of reaction too. The dramatic reassurance, the quick declaration that the relationship is stronger than any uncomfortable revelation. But Daniel didn't do that. He kept his eyes on the ring for another second before finally looking back up at her. His expression wasn't angry. If anything, it looked thoughtful, measured, like someone who was carefully processing everything they had just heard before deciding how to respond. That kind of reaction can sometimes feel even more unsettling than a direct argument, because when someone becomes quiet like that, it's impossible to know exactly what they're thinking. Are they hurt? Are they reconsidering everything? Or are they simply trying to slow down before making a decision they might regret? Lisa's fingers rested against the edge of the table now. Still, the gesture of removing the ring had changed something between them, even if neither of them said it out loud. Because symbols matter in relationships, and engagement rings are powerful symbols. They represent promises, expectations, a shared future people agree to step into together. Taking one off, even temporarily, sends a message whether that message was fully intentional or not. The air between them felt different now, more uncertain. Daniel eventually spoke again, but his voice was quieter than before. "I just need to think," he said. Lisa nodded slowly. That response wasn't rejection, but it wasn't reassurance either. It was something in between. And sometimes the space between those two things is where the most difficult emotions live. A few minutes later, the dinner began winding down. Neither of them tried to restart the conversation in a meaningful way. Small comments about the food or the restaurant appeared here and there, but the earlier tension remained sitting quietly between them. Eventually, the check arrived. Daniel paid without much discussion. They stood up from the table and walked out of the restaurant side by side, the cool evening air greeting them as they stepped outside. The conversation still unresolved, the ring still sitting inside the velvet box. From the outside, anyone watching them leave might have assumed it was just another quiet couple finishing dinner together. But the dynamic between them had shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. The engagement no longer felt certain. The future suddenly looked less defined. And yet, even after everything that had been revealed during that dinner, there was still one more piece of Lisa's story that Daniel hadn't heard. One more detail she had kept to herself. A secret that, once revealed, could change the entire situation all over again. As Daniel and Lisa walked away from the restaurant that night, the conversation they had just shared lingered quietly between them. Nothing had been fully resolved. No final decision had been made. The engagement hadn't officially ended, but it also didn't feel as solid as it had only hours earlier. Moments like that often leave relationships sitting in an uncomfortable middle space. Not broken, but no longer completely certain either. From Daniel's perspective, the evening had already delivered several unexpected revelations. First, the number of previous marriages. Then the admission that the most recent one still wasn't legally finalized. Each piece of information forced him to adjust the picture he had built in his mind about Lisa's past. It wasn't necessarily about judging the past itself. Many people carry complicated histories into new relationships. The real issue was timing. When important details appear late in the story, they don't just add information, they reshape trust. And trust, once shaken even slightly, has a way of making people look back at earlier conversations differently. Across the parking lot, Lisa walked quietly beside him. On the surface, it might have seemed like she had finally told Daniel the truth. She had opened up about her history, admitted the unfinished divorce, and allowed the conversation to unfold honestly at the dinner table. But the deeper reality was more complicated, because Daniel still didn't know the entire story. There were still pieces of Lisa's past that hadn't been fully explained. Not necessarily lies, but missing chapters. And partial honesty can sometimes create its own kind of tension. Psychologists often describe this as the delayed truth effect. When information surfaces gradually rather than all at once, it changes how people interpret the earlier revelations. Even if the person eventually becomes fully transparent, the staggered timeline can leave lingering questions. Why wasn't everything said from the beginning? Was the delay intentional? Or was it simply fear? Fear that revealing too much too soon might push someone away. Lisa herself may have been wrestling with exactly that fear. Revealing the 5 marriages had already been difficult. Admitting the unfinished legal divorce made the situation even more sensitive. But the rest of the story still existed in the background, waiting for the moment when it might eventually come into the light. And that's where the emotional complexity of this situation really lives. Because from one perspective, Lisa did something many relationship experts recommend. She told the truth before moving forward with a major commitment. Honesty, even when uncomfortable, can prevent much bigger problems later. But from Daniel's perspective, the timing could still feel unsettling. When someone proposes marriage, they usually believe they already understand the essential parts of their partner's past. Discovering new layers after that point can make the foundation feel less stable. Neither perspective is completely unreasonable. One person sees honesty arriving just in time. The other sees important information arriving very late. And relationships often struggle most when those two interpretations collide. Back in the restaurant, when Lisa placed the ring on the table, that gesture captured the entire emotional tension of the moment. Not a breakup, not a clear reconciliation, just uncertainty. The kind of quiet uncertainty that can slowly reshape a relationship over time. For viewers watching the moment unfold, it raises a fascinating question. Was this dinner simply an uncomfortable but necessary conversation that will eventually strengthen the relationship? Or was it something more subtle? The quiet beginning of a shift neither of them fully recognized yet. Sometimes relationships don't end with dramatic arguments or explosive confrontations. Sometimes they begin unraveling in quieter ways. A conversation that reveals too much too late. A moment of silence that changes how two people look at each other. A ring placed gently back on the table. And a question that remains unanswered long after the dinner ends. What happens next may depend on one thing Daniel still doesn't know: the rest of Lisa's story. Because if that final piece of the truth eventually surfaces, it could either repair the trust that wavered during that dinner, or confirm the doubts that quietly began forming that night. And that possibility leads directly into another dramatic relationship moment inside this franchise. A situation where a late revelation didn't just create tension at dinner. It changed everything.